Tighter pacing, rising tension, mix of urgent strings, distant drum, brush scrape SFX. Musical note SFX, a long, thin scritch, the sound of a brush across raw canvas. Low, distant drums begin to hum. The next morning, sunlight crept across the painted sky, like a thin wash of color. I was still halfway between sleep and wonder when I heard it. A faint, nervous sound, the scratch of a brush across an enormous canvas. The ground under my feet trembled. Not a quake in the earth, but a trembling in the frame itself, as if someone somewhere were stroking hard and fast. Is someone painting more? I muttered to myself, half expecting a cheeky reply from one of the girls. Red looked up at the sky, and her smile vanished. She frowned, the laugh lines on her face folding into something sharp. It's not that someone is painting, she said slowly. I think someone is erasing us. The words fell like cold water. For a moment, the world held its breath. Erasing? Green's voice came out thin, like a reed. Erasing what do you mean? Yellow ran to the water's edge and leaned over. Her face changed color faster than any palette could. Oh my God, she cried. The colors on the pond, they're fading. I followed her gaze. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but the streaks of pigment were literally thinning out, thinning into the gray wash beneath. The lotus tops that had been flushed with soft pink now sighed into ash. The brilliant band of color that traced the shore blurred like a smear. It was as if a giant hand were gently wiping the painting with a cloth. White rose from where she had been sitting, her face turning solemn. The painter is reworking the canvas, she said, voice steady as a bell. When he does, the old layers get taken away. Silence settled like a heavy varnish. We exchanged looks, each of us measuring the weirdness in our own way. Red slammed a hand on her hip and straightened, as if pulling herself into a portrait defiance. No, she planted her feet wide and raised her voice so that it cut through the water's soft buzzing. I will not be erased. If the painter thinks he can wipe me out, then I'll fight back. Fight the painter? I asked, incredulous. Yes, she said. Her eyes were bright and fierce. We'll make the canvas so chaotic, so unpredictable. He won't be able to repaint us cleanly. Green clutched at her hair. Red, this is not the Marvel Universe. But Red was already moving. She was a streak of flame through the lotus reeds. And before I could decide whether to follow her or stop her, she had pulled all of us into a whirl of action. We fled along the shore like spilled pigments. Musical note, SFX. Frantic brushstrokes, drums, the slap of fabric and splashes. We became a riot of gestures and ridiculous plans. Red grabbed an oversized brush and began throwing brushstrokes in broad, theatrical arcs across the water's reflection. Color flicked into the air like confetti. Green, practical and swift, scooped buckets of pond water and tossed them like fog. The water caught Red's thrown strokes and smeared them into new shapes. Yellow stood on a flat stone and swirled her palette, flinging dabs of luminous paint toward the sky, as if she could tangle the clouds in color. White, quiet but fierce, moved along the edges of the pond, patting and repressing the fading petals with her palms, as if she could glue memory back into place. I did what I could. I collected fallen petals, mixed little puddles of pigment on my palms, and smeared them on the edges of the canvas world like someone patching a torn coat. We were messy and earnest and terrified, and in our clumsiness there was something valiant. But the painter's hand, if it was a hand or a motion of thought, kept coming. Each swipe from above submitted more of our scene to a gray wash. The horizon blurred. A heron made of shadow drifted across the midground. When the wash passed, entire swathes of detail would simply not return. At one point, a huge, wind-like brushstroke swept across and peeled a whole section of background away. A ribbon of sky spooled into blankness. We stood on the edge of the missing space and looked into the raw linen, pale undercoat, and I felt my stomach drop. The idea of being reduced to underpainting was like the thought of being forgotten. Do more, Red shouted. Make it impossible to fix. Twist the composition. Overwhelm the margins. Make the lines lose their meaning. So we did. We threw paint into shapes that didn't make sense. We braided lotus stems into impossible knots. Painted extra eyes on a heron. Layered shadows over shadows as the pond looked like a night scene backwards. We made the world noisy, unreadable, a deliberate mess. There was an odd thrill and resistance. It felt like vandalism and like heroism at the same time. But even as we rioted in color, White stopped. I noticed her hands glow, the faintest glimmer, like pearl dust. She closed her eyes and murmured, and in a voice that was not a voice but memory itself, she said, "Hold on to what you are. Name what you are. Remember the small things." "What do you mean?" I asked over the drum of paint. White's eyes opened. "When I remember a thing clearly, I paint it not with strokes, but from whatever's left of my chest. If I place that memory tightly enough, it holds. If I do not, the painter can wash it away. Memory resists the eraser." She reached for the edge of her own sleeve and slowly, deliberately, she drew the line of her reflection. The motion was like stitching. I watched as texture returned. Not the wide bravado of broad strokes, but a fine, patient adherence of meaning. Little marks that matched the way she smiled as a child. The faint scar at the corner of her hand where a palette knife nicked her years ago. These were tiny things, but they clung. One by one, we found small things to hold on to and to draw. Red named the exact tilt of her laugh and painted it into the shadows. Green hummed the pattern of the pond's reeds and pressed it between the gray washes. Yellow placed the exact color of a certain morning light onto a single lotus petal and vowed to never let it be anything else. I thought of small things too. The smell of linseed oil at dawn, the way of the brush in my hand, and I painted them like charms. Slowly, painfully, the patches we cared for began to resist the gray. They became islands of stubborn color in a sea of erasure. But resistance has a limit, and the painter's movement was patient and thorough. The underpainting showed through more often than not. We learned, with a kind of brutal clarity, that spectacle could not always outpace slow, methodical revision. Sometimes 1,000 tiny stitches beat the loudest splash. There was a shift in me then. A realization I didn't want to be only spectacle maker or only rescuer. I wanted the memory to be made into form. I wanted to be more than someone who reacts. White saw this in my face and smiled the way the pond smiles at moonlight. "You can make a memory too," she said simply. "What small thing will you keep?" I thought of the moment when Red first laughed on the shore and her hair caught sun like sparks. I thought of Green's hands, the way she gathers water without thought. I thought of Yellow's steady insistence that light must be painted precisely because it flees. I thought of White's quiet habit of rubbing paint between her fingers until it was warm. Each image stitched something back into place. So I painted the small, ridiculous human things. The way Red pockets a stray curl when she's embarrassed. The way Green tucks a stray leaf behind her ear. Yellow's thumb smeared with cadmium. White's perfect tendency to remember names. With each tiny, deliberate act, the world regained texture. Not always perfect, but honest and stubborn. Musical note. SFX. The brush scritch grows softer, drum slow. A single violin sustains. When the hand drawing the paint finally slowed, we were not fully restored, but we were not entirely undone. The pond looked different, more patched and pristine, like a quilt that had been mended with loving, obvious stitches. The painter had tried to recompose us, and we had forced memory into the seams. We sat on the shore exhausted, wet, our gowns streaked with color that did not match any pigment chart. Red laughed, a wet, surprised sound. "Well," she said, "we did give him a headache." Green leaned her forehead against her knees and breathed. Yellow hummed the same tiny chord she'd hummed earlier. White watched us with calm eyes, as if the outcome had always been both in her hands and out of them. I looked at our patched, repaired field and felt an odd sort of pride. It was ugly in some places, miraculous in others, a living testament to being seen. "Maybe," White said softly, "we do not need a perfect canvas to be remembered. We need witnesses." I held that word like a pebble in my palm. Witnesses, not just to beauty, but to these small, stubborn habits and the way they anchor us. And for a breath after the painter's brush faded into silence, the world, flawed, halting and defiantly vibrant, breathed with us. Musical note SFX, a long, gentle exhale, the sound of painted wind. Music softens into pastoral piano. Would you like any part of Act 3 expanded into more detailed voice directions or broken into smaller scene beats for recording?